All right, let's move on to the story now. Today, Rwanda commemorated the 1994 genocide that led to the killing of 1 million Rwandans. The civil war broke out after the plane of the then president was shot down near Kigali Airport. Let's chat more about this now. Judge Navi Pillay, former president at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, joins me now. Ma'am, a very good evening to you. Thank you very much for joining us here on the SABC News channel.
Good evening to you and to viewers.
Judge Pillay, as we reflect, you presided over hearings into the Rwandan genocide. What was your experience?
My experience, I went there thinking I'll only serve a year and come back because we had just achieved our democracy in 1994 and I wanted to play a role here. But when I sat as a trial judge and later president, I grew to admire the witnesses who came forward with no benefit to them, just recalling all the horrors and telling the world what happened. There wouldn't have been trials if it wasn't for those brave victims who came forward to testify. So they inspired me to continue and stay on at the tribunal for about 8.5 years. Let me say that, Archbishop Desmond Tutu addressed the Rwandans and encouraged them to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission like we had in South Africa as a way forward. But the Rwandans rejected that. They wanted justice and accountability.
How different, strange enough, that was my next question. How different was the process to the TRC in South Africa in finding truth and closure?
Well, very many people in South Africa are unhappy with that process, and you can see the issues boiling today, issues such as the land question, and that there has been no justice and accountability for the perpetrators. All the information being exposed now about the arms deal is one example. As I said, as a judge in the Rwandan tribunal, there was evidence that some of the grenade shrapnel had the markings of armed score. And everybody in that courtroom looked at me. This is apartheid South Africa supplying the terrible weapons that was used in the genocide. So the Rwandans went to the Security Council and asked for an international tribunal because they realized that the other countries where the perpetrators had fled to would not hand over these suspects to Rwanda. And in fact, that was the position. But those countries, Kenya, the Cameroon, DRC, Europe, France, they handed over their suspects to the International Tribunal because it was independent and staffed by independent judges. Now, Judge, I would say that they got justice and accountability of all the key perpetrators.
Now, Judge Pillay, in your role there, many would say you're remembered for, amongst other things, on your ruling that rape and sexual assault constitutes acts of genocide. Now, how important is this message, even in conflict today? If we look at the reports that are coming out of Cabo Delgado in Mozambique and Tigray, because back then you had said that rape is no longer a trophy of war.
I have seen like US military manuals during the Vietnam War. The women were offered as rewards to the soldiers. You fight well, you can have those yellow women. And so traditionally, the attitude seems to be that the rape and sexual violence against women and girls is not a crime. So it was not recognized as a war crime, not prosecuted in the Nuremberg trials or the Tokyo trials. So the very first conviction and spelling out the elements of the crime came from the Rwanda Tribunal, the ICTR. So there was so much criticism of this tribunal, I can't tell you. They compared us to the Hague Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, and media would say this is yet another African institution bound to fail. And this is why I'm so proud that we produced the world's first jurisprudence that rape and sexual violence constituted not only war crimes and crimes against humanity, but genocide, because in this case, the rapes were aimed at Tutsi women only with the intent of destroying the Tutsi group. Then it falls under genocide.
That was truly historic indeed. I mean, if we look back now, has the world done enough to ensure that we don't have similar atrocities around the world? If you look at Yemen, for example.
You know that subsequently I served as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I found again and again where conflicts happened, like in Syria, Libya, and so on, there was evidence, massive evidence of sexual violence against women and girls, but a huge reluctance or resistance to investigate and prosecute these crimes. So people constantly ask me, how do I feel that the Rwandan genocide decision in the Akayesu case has not been followed in other investigations by other tribunals since then. So there has to be, like we are dealing with gender-based violence in South Africa, an education and a dramatic change of attitude where people must realize that these are terrible crimes committed against women.
But how does
we are not property.
Yes. How does it then persist? I want to go back to what I was speaking about earlier, looking at reports coming out of Mozambique. What you had done then was quite historic. But when you look at reports coming out of Mozambique, that is allegedly taking place today. When we look at other areas where reports seem to suggest that it is still being used as a trophy of war, a trophy of instability in certain sections of society. Why does that persist?
This is such an important issue that you are raising. Human rights activists continue to ask these questions. Before our eyes, we see what is happening to victims in Mozambique. We saw aerial killings and rape of women and children in various conflicts, including Sri Lanka. This is why I'm constantly being called to speak on these issues, because it has to be urgently redressed when these rape and sexual violence are as serious as killings.
Judge Navi Pillay, what a pleasure it is to speak to you on our program tonight. Thank you very much indeed. The former president at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, quite a number of historic rulings that she had made there. You recall, of course, during that particular time, what we'd spoken about is that some of the atrocities that are believed to be taking place in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique speak directly to some of the roles that she had played during that tribunal into Rwanda, in that, the ruling that rape and sexual assault had constituted a genocide is one of the historic moments that had come out of that particular ruling pertaining to a mayor at the time in that part of the world. But of course, some of the reports coming out of Mozambique in Tigray, as well as Cabo Delgado in particular, in Mozambique, seem to speak to issues relating to what she had then said, that rape should not be used as a trophy of war. I want to bring in now Africa political specialist Charles Nyuykonge. He joins me now. Mr. Nyuykonge, a very good evening to you. Thanks indeed for your time. So when we reflect, I think many people still ask the question, why the world watched and did nothing? Why did the world watch and do nothing at the time? Have we any answers to that so many years later?
I think that's a fair question, why the world watched and did nothing. Precisely because at the time, I think the Rwandan sovereign state under President Juvenal Habyarimana was of the view that these were internal issues and that they could still resolve it. Despite, of course, some warning signs from the UN that we have had numerous occasions to read from the then representative of the Secretary General, Romeo Dallaire. I think by and large, these really sit around what we consider structural issues to conflict, and the death of the president was just a trigger, which the 100 days or the 3 months that followed, leading to over 100 deaths, is what actually opened the eyes of the world to say, yes, the structural issues which had bedeviled this country, the polarization of ethnicity, on the one hand by the Belgians who actually presented the Tutsis as the preferred or as the most intelligent, the most educated, that this had actually led to a situation where the Hutus really felt disenfranchised and felt maybe at some point they had to take their revenge. And so, of course, till date, it still remains a mystery who killed Habyarimana, the president. Some people have pointed to His Excellency Kagame, who has retorted back and he has said the Hutus, actually, the extremist Hutus had to do that because he was seen as a pacifier. But by and large, suffice to say that Rwanda, 27 years later, has come a long way.
And it brings me to, the words of the former Secretary General of the United Nations, the late Kofi Annan. I think that address was in 2004 to the Commission on Human Rights, where he said, we must never forget our collective failure to protect hundreds of thousands of defenseless men and women and children who perished in Rwanda. Then it was 10 years ago. But how do we ensure that it does not happen again?
It does not happen again if we have in place early warning signals, and if states actually take those early warning signals from both their internal agencies as well as from the regional economic mechanisms, which occasionally send reports to states to identify fault lines which can eventually trigger conflicts. If states take some of these things seriously, perhaps they can engage the necessary policy measures to prevent this kind of violence.
But we still have conflicts on the continent. We're talking about Mozambique, for example. That's where we are at the moment. And you have other areas as well, Tigray, Kar. There's no stability there as well. Did we learn at all what should be done before things get out of hand?
I think that's a tough question. Did we learn it at all? I think the responsibility is shared by different constituencies, different stakeholders. Did Africans learn it? You will see, for instance, that some Africans, I think I can quote Pierre Lumumba of Kenya, that Africans would elect a corrupt person in a position of power and take an intellectual would not make it there. If our parliaments, for instance, are fueled or are filled by persons who cannot make laws, then we have a responsibility there as Africans. But also, if our governors, if our policymakers, our politicians themselves are not taking seriously early signals of what could potentially destabilize different countries and the regions, then we are not learning lessons. But I think at the same time that Rwanda has taught the continent a number of things about addressing deep and structural issues of conflict. In the last 27 years, there's been a new language policy, there's been a new legal system, there's been new development agenda, there's been job creation, and I think in the continent at the moment, and perhaps in the world, Rwanda is the one that sits with about 2% unemployment, and I think that is something which is commendable. And I think these are positive lessons which different states learned, but suffice to see how many have.
Mr. Nyuykonge, I mean, the African Union had set up a target of silencing the guns in 2020. Well, that's gone by. We're seeing more conflict. So what must the African Union do?
The African Union set the silencing the gun agenda. Yes, that was sometime around 2016. And these guns were supposed to be silenced by 2020. So first to say that there's been significant work which has been done. The APSA roadmap has helped in a way to build the regional capacities to respond immediately to conflict. You say that we have more conflicts. We should have had conflicts in the Gambia. We don't have conflicts in the Gambia. The conflict in Nigeria escalated. Libya is on the way to a truce. South Sudan has actually managed its transition successfully. The DRC has managed its political transition successfully. And the conflict in Somalia has also reduced. I think when we look at these things it is loud and perhaps not very honest to say that not much has been done. I think a lot has been done, and we need to acknowledge that, but also say that more still has to be done,
Sure.
and I think that they're on the right.
Africa political specialist, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Charles Nyuykonge joining us here on the program. Thanks indeed for your time. Let's go.